My name is Victoria, and for 32 years, I've desperately sought my father's approval. Last month, he gathered our entire family to announce his will. "You're a useless child," he declared, smiling cruelly as he promised my brother everything. "Michael deserves it. You don't." The room fell silent as I fought back tears. Then something unexpected happened. The lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Actually, what followed changed everything I thought I knew about my family." Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever dealt with family betrayal. Trust me, you'll want to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of being the family disappointment. Growing up in the Henderson household meant living under my father Frank's impossibly high standards. As the CEO of Henderson Financial Group, he expected nothing less than perfection from his children. Our 5-bedroom colonial in Connecticut's wealthiest neighborhood was more showcase than home, much like his children were more achievements to display than people to love. I still remember bringing home my report card in 6th grade, proudly showing my A- in advanced mathematics. Most parents would have been thrilled, but not Frank Henderson. An A-? He examined the paper as if it contained something offensive. "Victoria, the Hendersons don't do minus anything. Michael got straight as last semester. What happened here?" "I tried really hard, Dad. The teacher said I was one of the top students," I explained, my voice growing smaller. "Trying isn't succeeding. Fix this next quarter." He handed back the report card without meeting my eyes, already turning to his laptop. That night, I cried into my pillow, wondering what was wrong with me. This pattern continued throughout my childhood. Dance recitals where my form was sloppy, science fair projects that were uninspired, college application essays that lacked ambition. Nothing I did ever measured up. My brother Michael, however, could do no wrong. 2 years younger than me, he was the golden child from the moment he was born. When Michael received similar grades to mine, Dad would take him for ice cream to celebrate. When Michael won 2nd place in a debate tournament, Dad praised his public speaking skills for weeks. The same achievement from me would have been met with questions about why I hadn't won 1st place. "Michael has a natural talent for business," Dad would tell his colleagues while I stood awkwardly beside them at company picnics. "He'll take over Henderson Financial someday.
He has the instinct for it."
Never mind that I had expressed interest in the business, or that my academic performance in economics actually surpassed my brother's. The weekends were the most obvious display of favoritism. Dad would take Michael golfing at the country club, fishing at our lake house, or to basketball games. Man time, he called it. I was never invited. When I asked once if I could join them golfing, Dad laughed and said, "Victoria, golf is a game of precision and patience. It's not really your thing." By the time I reached high school, Michael had fully absorbed Dad's attitude toward me. He'd roll his eyes when I spoke at dinner, interrupt my stories, or make subtle digs about my accomplishments. "Nice job on getting into the honor society, Vic. Everyone gets in if they just turn in their homework," he'd say, while Dad nodded in agreement. The only refuge I had was my mother, Eleanor. Where Dad was cold and critical, Mom was warm and encouraging. She'd sit on my bed after particularly harsh interactions with Dad and stroke my hair. "Your father shows love differently," she'd explain, though I could see in her eyes she didn't fully believe it herself. "He pushes because he wants you to be strong." Mom taught me to find value in myself beyond Dad's approval. She attended every school event, cheered loudly at my performances, and created space where I could be myself without judgment. We had Sunday afternoon traditions of baking cookies together and reading in the sunroom, small moments of normalcy in our otherwise tense household. "You have a beautiful mind and a compassionate heart, Victoria," she'd tell me. "Those are gifts the world needs more than anything." When Dad would criticize my decision to join environmental causes rather than student government, "Colleges want leaders, not tree huggers," Mom would quietly counter later, "Standing up for what you believe in is the purest form of leadership." Their disagreements about parenting were usually subtle, happening in hushed tones behind closed doors. Occasionally, I'd overhear fragments. "You're too hard on her, Frank," or "She needs to toughen up, Eleanor. The world isn't kind to the soft." Mom became my interpreter of Dad's harshness, my buffer against his disappointment. With her, I felt seen and valued. With her, I could imagine a future where I was enough exactly as I was. Then, when I was 18 and preparing to leave for college, Mom was diagnosed with aggressive ovarian cancer. The disease moved quickly, giving us only 8 months from diagnosis to loss. I'll never forget those hospital visits, the smell of antiseptic mixing with the floral scent of Mom's favorite lotion that I'd bring to help her feel more comfortable. Dad was there physically, handling medical decisions and insurance paperwork with his typical efficiency, but emotionally, he was more distant than ever. Michael received Dad's attention and comfort during this time. They'd huddle together in hospital waiting rooms, Dad's arm around Michael's shoulders, whispering about treatments and contingency plans. I sat across from them, clutching Mom's worn copy of Jane Austen, feeling like an outsider in my own family grief. "Take care of your brother when I'm gone," Mom told me during one of our last private conversations, her hand cool and light in mine. "And Victoria, promise me you'll live your life for yourself, not for your father's approval." I promised, but I didn't fully understand what she meant until years later. After she died, I was left with so many unasked questions, so many conversations we should have had. The guilt of those unspoken words haunted me as much as the grief. Dad became even more critical after Mom's death, as if her absence removed the last barrier of restraint. He questioned my choice of college major, environmental science instead of business. My summer internships with conservation groups instead of financial firms, my whole direction in life. "Your mother indulged your whims, Victoria, but it's time to grow up," he said when I told him about my college plans. "I won't finance foolishness." True to his word, he refused to help with my education unless I changed my major. Michael, meanwhile, received a fully funded education at Dad's alma mater, where he joined Dad's old fraternity and studied business, as expected. I took out loans, applied for scholarships, worked part-time jobs, and made my way through college on my own terms. It was during my sophomore year that I met Rachel Martinez in an environmental ethics class. She was brilliant, passionate, and most importantly, believed in me without reservation. "Your dad sounds like a piece of work," she said bluntly after hearing my stories. "But look at you, building your own life despite him. That takes serious strength, Victoria." Rachel became the family I chose, the sister I needed. We stayed up late studying, shared cramped apartments to save money, and dreamed of making real change in the world. When I doubted myself, hearing Dad's critical voice in my head, Rachel would counter with encouragement and perspective. After graduation, I pursued environmental law, combining my passion for nature with practical skills that could make a difference. Each small success in my career felt like a personal victory, proof that I could thrive without Dad's approval or support. By 30, I had built a respectable career as an environmental attorney, specializing in cases against corporate polluters. The irony wasn't lost on me that some of my opponents were companies similar to Dad's investment clients. I found purpose in my work, validation in courtroom victories, and slowly began to heal from years of feeling inadequate. I met Daniel Collins at a climate policy conference where I was speaking. He was a renewable energy engineer with kind eyes and a quiet confidence I found immediately attractive. On our third date, after I shared some stories about my family, he looked at me with genuine confusion. "I don't understand how your father couldn't be incredibly proud of you," he said. "You're remarkable, Victoria." With Daniel, I experienced what unconditional support felt like in a romantic relationship. He celebrated my victories without comparison and comforted my setbacks without judgment. For the first time, I began to imagine a family of my own that wouldn't carry forward the patterns of my childhood. My contact with Dad and Michael dwindled to obligatory holiday calls and occasional family gatherings that inevitably ended with tension. Dad would interrogate me about my career, making thinly veiled comments about real success, while praising Michael's every promotion and investment decision. Michael had indeed followed Dad into finance, becoming his right-hand man at Henderson Financial. He married Stephanie, a woman Dad approved of from a good family, And they had twin boys who received the doting grandfather treatment I could never have imagined Dad capable of showing. I built my life carefully around my chosen family of supportive friends and Daniel, creating distance from the criticism and comparison that defined my childhood home. I was healing, slowly but surely, creating a life that would have made Mom proud. Then, last spring, Aunt Margaret called with news that would pull me back into the family dynamics I'd worked so hard to escape. The call came on a Tuesday evening while Daniel and I were making dinner in our apartment. Aunt Margaret, Mom's sister, rarely called out of the blue, so seeing her name on my phone immediately sent a wave of concern through me. "Victoria," she said, her voice heavy, "I thought you should hear this from family rather than finding out another way. Your father has been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors are giving him 3 to 6 months." The wooden spoon I was holding clattered to the counter. Despite everything, despite the years of criticism and emotional distance, the news hit me with unexpected force. "Have you told Michael?" I asked, falling back on practicalities when emotions became too complicated. "Your father called him directly," Aunt Margaret said, the implication clear. Michael had been told first, by Dad himself. I'd received the news secondhand, as an afterthought. After hanging up, I stood frozen in the kitchen until Daniel gently guided me to the couch. "Talk to me," he said, his hand warm on mine. "I don't know what I'm feeling," I admitted. "Sad, angry, guilty for not feeling sad enough?" Part of me wants to see him, to try one last time for some kind of resolution. Another part thinks it's pointless after all these years. Daniel didn't offer easy answers or platitudes. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you," he said simply. "But ask yourself what you'll regret more in 10 years. Trying again, or not trying at all." After a sleepless night, I decided to visit Dad at the hospital. I told myself it was the right thing to do, the adult thing, but secretly I harbored a small hope that facing mortality might soften him, might finally open a door to the father-daughter relationship I'd always wanted. The hospital room was exactly as I'd imagined, sterile, beeping with monitors, smelling of disinfectant. What I hadn't prepared for was how small Dad looked in the hospital bed, his commanding presence diminished by illness. Michael was already there, of course, sitting in the visitor's chair reviewing medical documents. "Victoria," Dad acknowledged me with a slight nod, his voice weaker, but his eyes still sharp. "You didn't need to come." For words that perfectly encapsulated our relationship. "You didn't need to come." Not "thank you for coming," or "I'm glad to see you," but a statement that highlighted my superfluousness to his life. "I wanted to," I said simply, setting the flowers I'd brought on the windowsill. Michael gave me an awkward side hug. "Dad's starting a new treatment tomorrow. I've been researching specialists and clinical trials." His tone carried the subtle message that he was handling everything, that he was the child who stepped up when it mattered. For 20 minutes, I sat while they discussed treatment options, insurance details, and company matters. Neither asked my opinion or included me in the conversation. When a nurse came in to administer medication, I offered to get coffee for everyone, grateful for an excuse to leave the room briefly. When I returned, I caught a glimpse of something unexpected. Dad was looking out the window, his expression unguarded for once, showing fear and perhaps regret. When he noticed me at the door, the vulnerability vanished, replaced by his usual mask of control. "The company announcement will need to be carefully worded," he was saying to Michael as I handed out the coffees. "We can't risk investor panic." "I can help draft something," I offered. "Communication during crisis is part of what I do." Dad looked at me as if I'd suggested something absurd. "Henderson Financial requires a certain expertise, Victoria. Michael has it covered." And just like that, any hope I'd had for a deathbed reconciliation evaporated. Even facing mortality, Frank Henderson couldn't find it in himself to value what I brought to the table. I left the hospital an hour later with a hollow feeling in my chest. In the parking lot, I called Rachel, now a successful environmental scientist living across town. "He's exactly the same," I told her, starting my car. "I don't know why I expected anything different." "Because you're a hopeful person," Rachel said. "That's not a weakness, Vic. even if he made you feel like it was. 2 weeks later, a formal letter arrived from Dad's executive assistant. The Henderson family was requested to attend a meeting regarding estate matters at the family home the following Saturday. The formal language and third-person phrasing felt coldly appropriate for our family dynamics. "You don't have to go," Rachel said over lunch that week. "After everything, you're allowed to protect yourself." "If I don't go, I'll just be confirming what he's always thought of me," I argued. "That I'm weak, that I run from difficult situations." "Standing up for yourself isn't running," Rachel countered. "Sometimes it's walking away with your head held high." I spent days debating whether to attend, alternating between determination to face whatever Dad had planned and dread at subjecting myself to more family dysfunction. Ultimately, my curiosity won out. I wanted to know what Dad had decided, wanted to see this final chapter through, even if the ending was as disappointing as the story had been. "I'll come with you and wait in the car," Daniel offered. "Just say the word and we'll leave, no questions asked." Saturday arrived with unseasonable rain, dark clouds hanging low over the city as Daniel drove us to the sprawling colonial house where I'd grown up. The property looked immaculate as always, Dad's illness having no impact on the rigorous maintenance schedule he demanded. Inside, the formal living room had been arranged like a business meeting. Aunt Margaret was there, along with Uncle Robert, a few cousins, and some of Dad's closest business associates. Michael and Stephanie sat nearest to the large leather chair that had been positioned prominently at the head of the room, clearly meant for Dad. I took a seat near the back, nodding greetings to relatives I rarely saw. The tension in the room was palpable, everyone speaking in hushed tones as if already at a funeral rather than a family meeting. Dad entered last, moving slowly but refusing assistance, wearing a suit despite his weight loss and pallor. He took his seat with the careful movements of someone in pain but determined not to show it. "Thank you all for coming," he began without preamble. "As you know, my time is limited, and I want to ensure an orderly transition of my affairs." For the next 20 minutes, he outlined his business succession plan, speaking proudly of Michael's preparation to take over Henderson Financial. He detailed charitable bequests, maintenance provisions for the family properties, and specific items designated for various relatives. Not once did he mention my name. As the meeting continued, I felt increasingly invisible, watching family members nod and occasionally glance my way with awkward expressions. Everyone in the room realized the omission, but no one spoke up. Finally, after announcing a significant donation to his alma mater in Michael's name, Dad turned his gaze to me for the first time. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I'm sure you're wondering where you fit in these arrangements." The sudden attention of everyone in the room burned against my skin. I straightened my spine and met his eyes steadily. "I've given this considerable thought," Dad continued. "Michael has dedicated his life to the Henderson legacy. He's shown commitment, business acumen, and loyalty to family traditions." Dad's lips curved in what might have been a smile, but felt more like a sneer. "You chose a different path. Against my advice, against family tradition, against your own interests. You've spent your career opposing the very industries that built your privilege." The room was completely still now, the collective discomfort almost suffocating. "You're a useless child when it comes to preserving what I've built," Dad said, the words falling like physical blows. "Michael deserves everything. You don't. My will reflects this reality." Gasps and murmurs broke the silence. Aunt Margaret made a noise of protest, quickly silenced by Dad's raised hand. "The Henderson fortune and all associated properties will pass to Michael, who understands their value and will steward them appropriately," Dad concluded, nodding to a man I recognized as his attorney, who began distributing folders to Michael and several business associates. I sat frozen, the public humiliation washing over me in waves. It wasn't the inheritance itself that hurt, but the deliberate cruelty, the public declaration of my worthlessness in front of everyone who mattered to him. Somehow, I found my voice. "Thank you for your honesty, Dad," I said, standing on legs that threatened to buckle. "I've never wanted your money. I only wanted your respect, but I stopped expecting that long ago." I looked around the room, at the uncomfortable faces of relatives, at Michael's poorly concealed satisfaction, at the man who had never been able to see me clearly. "I'm sorry you're ill," I continued, "but I'm not sorry for the life I've built or the person I've become. Mom would have been proud of me, even if you never were." Without waiting for a response, I walked out, head high despite the tears threatening to spill. In the car, Daniel took one look at my face and simply drove, letting me sit in silence until I was ready to speak. "He called me useless," I finally said as we reached the highway. "In front of everyone," said I didn't deserve anything. Then the tears came, hard and fast. Years of rejection crystallized in that single, devastating moment. The week after Dad's announcement, I took sick leave from work. The public humiliation had reopened wounds I thought had long scarred over, leaving me raw and exhausted. I spent the first day in bed, replaying Dad's words, hearing "useless child" echo in my mind until the phrase lost all meaning. Daniel handled everything, calling my office, bringing me tea, holding me when the tears came without warning. His quiet support was a lifeline, but even his reassurances couldn't fully counteract a lifetime of paternal rejection. "I should be over this by now," I said on the second night, staring at our bedroom ceiling. "I'm 32 years old, successful in my career, in a healthy relationship. Why does his opinion still matter?" "Because he's your father," Daniel said simply. "And because what he did was cruel. You're allowed to be hurt by cruelty, Victoria." His anger on my behalf was comforting in its own way. Daniel, normally so measured and calm, spoke of my father with an edge I rarely heard in his voice. What kind of man humiliates his daughter like that? What does he get from it? I had no answers, only the familiar ache of never being enough. Rachel arrived on the third day with grocery bags full of comfort food and a determination to pull me out of bed. "Shower," she commanded, opening curtains and letting light flood the room. "Then food, then we talk." Over pasta and wine, I recounted every excruciating detail of the family meeting. Rachel listened, her expressive face shifting between outrage and sympathy. "Your father," she said when I finished, "is a textbook narcissist who can't handle you being different from his narrow vision. That's his failure, not yours." But what if he's right? The question that had haunted me for days finally emerged. What if I am useless in the ways that matter? Rachel put down her fork with a clatter. "Victoria Henderson, stop it. You've won environmental protection cases that changed corporate policies. You've mentored law students. You volunteer at the legal aid clinic. You're the most valuable friend I have." Her eyes were fierce with conviction. "The only useless thing in your life is the mental real estate you're letting your father occupy." That night, unable to sleep, I found myself in our spare room closet, pulling out a box of old family photos I'd kept despite everything. There I was at 8, sitting at the grand piano in the living room, spine straight as I'd been taught, looking nervous during my first recital. Dad stood behind me, his expression critical even then, while Mom beamed from the side, her pride unmistakable. Another photo. High school graduation, me at the podium delivering the valedictorian speech. Mom in the front row, tissue in hand, while Dad's seat remained conspicuously empty. He'd had an unavoidable business meeting that day, though he'd attended Michael's graduation the following year. Pattern after pattern revealed themselves in these frozen moments. Me achieving, Dad dismissing. Me reaching out, Dad turning away. Me eventually stopping both, protecting myself by expecting nothing. In my next therapy session, Dr. Winters listened as I unpacked the family meeting and its aftermath. "What would it mean," she asked carefully, "to truly accept that you'll never get your father's approval? Not as a defeat, but as a liberation." I thought I had accepted it. I admitted. But obviously not, if his words still have this power. "There's a difference between intellectually accepting something and emotionally processing it," she replied. "Perhaps this painful experience is actually an opportunity to finally grieve what you never had and never will have with your father." The conversation shifted something in me, a small but significant realignment of perspective. What if Dad's cruelty wasn't a reflection of my worth, but simply a continuation of his own limitations? What if freedom meant finally, truly giving up the hope of his approval? I was contemplating these questions the following Sunday when my doorbell rang unexpectedly. Opening it revealed Michael, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes, so different from his usual business attire. "Can I come in?" he asked, shifting his weight from one foot to another. The surprise of seeing him at my door left me momentarily speechless. In all our adult years, Michael had never once visited my home uninvited. "Sure," I finally managed, stepping aside. He wandered into my living room, examining the bookshelves and photographs as if they might explain something about the sister he'd never really known. "Nice place," he offered awkwardly. "Thanks. Why are you here, Michael?" He sank onto my couch, suddenly looking tired. "Dad's getting worse. Hospice is being discussed." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it despite everything. "But I'm guessing you didn't come just to update me on his condition." Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture reminiscent of our father. "What he said to you at the meeting. It was harsh." "It was cruel," I corrected, "and completely in character." "Yeah," Michael agreed, surprising me. "Look, Victoria, Dad has expectations. I've spent my whole life meeting them because it was easier than fighting them. And I spent my whole life failing to meet them because I couldn't be someone I'm not," I countered. Michael nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're useless. Different from what Dad values, sure, but not useless." It wasn't exactly a heartfelt apology for years of enabling Dad's behavior, but from Michael, it was something close to a breakthrough. "There's more to the inheritance situation than what Dad said publicly," Michael added, his voice lower. "Things have been complicated at Henderson Financial lately." Before he could elaborate, his phone rang. Checking it, he stood abruptly. "I have to take this. It's Stephanie with the kids." He moved toward the door, then hesitated. "Just don't make any public statements about the will or inheritance, okay? For everyone's sake." After he left, his cryptic warning lingered, adding another layer of confusion to an already complicated situation. What wasn't Dad saying about the company? What did Michael know that I didn't? That evening, restless and unable to focus, I decided to clean out more of my storage closet, a task I'd been procrastinating for months. Behind winter coats and old law school textbooks, I found a small box I didn't immediately recognize. Inside was a leather-bound journal with my mother's distinctive monogram. I'd never seen it before, certainly hadn't packed it myself. A note tucked into the front page explained its presence. "Found this while cleaning out Mom's old desk. Thought you might want it. Margaret." Aunt Margaret must have slipped it to me months ago, and in the chaos of everyday life, I'd forgotten about it. With trembling hands, I opened the first page, dated just after my 16th birthday. "I worry about Victoria," Mom had written in her elegant script. "Frank's criticism is crushing her spirit. Today he belittled her photography exhibit that won the school prize, saying art was a hobby, not a future." I saw something dim in her eyes when he said it. I won't let him extinguish her light. Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading. Entry after entry documented Mom's concerns about Dad's treatment of me, her efforts to counterbalance his criticism, her pride in my accomplishments that Dad dismissed. Then, dated 3 months before her diagnosis, an entry that made my heart stop. "Met with Theodore today to finalize arrangements. Frank would be furious if he knew, but I need to ensure Victoria is protected after I'm gone. The separate trust is established. Even Frank can't touch it. Victoria will have options, independence, the freedom to become whoever she chooses without financial pressure to conform to Frank's vision." I read the passage 3 times, trying to understand. Mom had set up some kind of trust for me? Without Dad's knowledge? And who was Theodore? Further entries mentioned the arrangements, but never in specific detail, as if Mom was being deliberately vague even in her private journal. The final entries, written during her illness, grew shorter but more determined. The last one, dated just a week before she died, read simply, "Told Theodore to wait until the right moment." Victoria will need this most when Frank's control seems absolute. She is stronger than she knows. I sat on the closet floor until dawn, reading and rereading the journal, feeling both connected to my mother and confused by her cryptic messages. What had she arranged? Why hadn't I known about it? And most importantly, was it still in effect after all these years? Before I could investigate further, Aunt Margaret called with news that Dad had taken a turn for the worse and entered hospice care at home. The doctors are saying days, maybe a week, she said gently. I know things are strained, but you should know. The complicated grief I felt was impossible to articulate. I was losing a father who had never really been mine to begin with, mourning a relationship that had existed only in my childhood wishes. Will you visit? Daniel asked when I shared the news. I thought of the last hospital visit, of Dad's dismissal, of the public humiliation. No, I said finally. I've said my goodbyes in my own way. Showing up now would be about appearances, not reality. Daniel supported my decision without judgment, another reminder of how different healthy love was from what I'd grown up with. 3 days later, an official-looking envelope arrived from Theodore Blackwell, ESQ, of Blackwell and Associates. The name sent a jolt through me, connecting immediately to Mom's journal. This must be the Theodore she'd mentioned. The letter inside was formal but clear. In accordance with established legal protocols, your presence is requested at the reading of Franklin Henderson's last will and testament, to be held at our offices on Friday, May 15th at 10 a.m. Despite my resolution to distance myself from family drama, this invitation felt different. This wasn't Dad's territory, or Michael's. And if this Theodore was the same man Mom had trusted with her arrangements, I needed to be there. Rachel went shopping with me the day before, helping me choose an outfit that would make me feel confident and protected. Navy blue, she decided, holding up a structure dress. Powerful, but not trying too hard. Add your grandmother's pearl earrings, and you'll look unshakable. That night, I barely slept, rehearsing potential scenarios in my head. What if the will was even more insulting than Dad's public announcement? What if Michael challenged me directly? What if I lost my composure? Whatever happens tomorrow, Daniel said as we lay in bed, remember that your worth isn't determined by a legal document or your father's opinion. And remember that you have people who see you clearly and love what they see. I held those words close as dawn broke on what would prove to be one of the most pivotal days of my life. Blackwell and Associates occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building, all glass and polished wood, speaking of old money and discretion. The receptionist directed me to a large conference room where family members were already gathering. Michael stood near the window, deep in conversation with 2 of Dad's business partners. He glanced up as I entered, his expression unreadable. Aunt Margaret immediately came to my side, squeezing my hand in silent support. You look well, Victoria, she said. Strong. I'm trying to be, I admitted quietly. The room filled quickly with familiar faces, cousins, uncles, Dad's golf buddies, his executive team. The social hierarchy was visible in the seating arrangements, with Michael and key business associates taking positions nearest the head of the table, where an elderly gentleman I assumed was Theodore Blackwell organized documents with methodical precision. At precisely 10 a.m., Theodore cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. Thank you all for coming during this difficult time, he began, his voice carrying authority despite its gentleness. Before we proceed with the reading of Franklin Henderson's will, I must share some news that many of you may not yet have heard. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room with genuine sympathy. Franklin Henderson passed away at 11:42 last night at his home, surrounded by medical staff. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Though we'd all known it was coming, the finality of it still landed with impact. Michael's face crumpled momentarily before he regained control. Aunt Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. I sat very still, feeling oddly numb. My father was gone. The complicated, brilliant, difficult man who had shaped so much of my life through his approval and disapproval was simply gone. On behalf of the Henderson family, Theodore continued, I extend appreciation for your presence today as we honor Franklin's final wishes. For the next few minutes, the room sat in respectful silence as Theodore outlined the standard legal preliminaries. I found myself studying the faces around me, wondering how many shared my complicated grief, how many had seen different sides of my father than I had known. Franklin requested a video message be played before the formal reading, Theodore explained, nodding to an assistant who dimmed the lights and activated a large screen on the wall. Dad's face appeared, gaunt but composed, clearly recorded in his final weeks. Despite his illness, his eyes retained their characteristic intensity, his posture as commanding as his health allowed. "If you're watching this, I've left this world," he began without preamble, his voice thinner than I remembered, but still authoritative. "I've never been one for sentimental goodbyes, so I'll keep this brief." He outlined his vision for Henderson Financial's future, emphasizing stability and continuity under Michael's leadership. He spoke of his legacy in terms of market share and investment returns, of his pride in the Henderson name becoming synonymous with financial excellence. Then his expression shifted subtly as he addressed personal matters. "To my son, Michael, I leave not just my company, but my complete confidence in your ability to preserve and expand the Henderson legacy. You've proven yourself worthy of everything I've built." Michael nodded slightly, his expression solemn but satisfied. "To my daughter Victoria," Dad continued, his tone noticeably cooler, "I acknowledge your choice to pursue a different path, one fundamentally at odds with the values that built your privilege. As I stated during our family meeting, the Henderson fortune requires a steward who appreciates its origins and purpose. That is not you, and so you will not share in it." The explicit disinheritance, repeated now beyond the grave, sent a ripple of discomfort through the room. Several people avoided looking at me, staring instead at their hands or the table. "My will reflects these decisions in full legal detail," Dad concluded. "Henderson Financial Group, all associated properties, investments, and assets will transfer to Michael, who understands their value and will honor my legacy appropriately." The screen went dark, leaving the room in momentary silence. I sat motionless, focusing on my breathing, refusing to show the hurt that pulsed beneath my composed exterior. Theodore allowed a respectful pause before rising again. "Thank you for those words, Franklin," he said formally. "We will now proceed with the official reading of the will." As Theodore began to read through the legal document, confirming exactly what Dad had stated in his video, I noticed something odd. The elderly lawyer seemed to be rushing slightly, as if moving through necessary formalities to reach something else. His eyes occasionally flicked toward me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. After confirming Michael as the sole inheritor of Henderson Financial and all associated assets, Theodore paused, removing his glasses and addressing the room with a different tone. "Actually," he said, the word hanging in the air with unexpected weight, "there are additional legal matters we must address before considering Franklin's estate fully settled." Michael straightened in his chair, frowning slightly. "What additional matters?" "The will is clear." Theodore nodded respectfully. "The will as drafted by Franklin is indeed clear, Mr. Henderson. However, there are pre-existing legal constraints on certain assets that must be acknowledged." From his briefcase, Theodore withdrew a separate set of documents bound in blue covers, different from the standard legal papers he'd been reading. "These documents were not prepared by our firm," he explained, "but by Eleanor Henderson's legal representatives before her death. They establish binding agreements that take precedence over subsequent arrangements." My heart began to race as Mom's journal entries suddenly connected with what was happening. Theodore must be the same lawyer Mom had mentioned, the one she'd trusted with her arrangements. "I don't understand," Michael said, his confident demeanor slipping slightly. "What agreements?" Theodore turned to me directly for the first time. "Miss Henderson, your mother established a separate trust in your name approximately 1 year before her passing. This trust holds specific assets that were legally removed from the joint Henderson estate with appropriate documentation at that time." Murmurs rippled through the room as Theodore continued. "Franklin Henderson was made aware of these arrangements after Eleanor's death and made several attempts to contest them. All such attempts were rejected by the courts, as the documentation was impeccable and Eleanor's competency at the time of the trust's establishment was well documented. I struggled to process what I was hearing. Mom had not only created a trust for me, but had done so in a way that Dad couldn't undo, despite his obvious attempts. And he had never once mentioned it to me, letting me believe I was completely cut off. In my briefcase, Theodore continued, I have a sealed letter from Eleanor Henderson, to be read only in the event that Franklin attempted to circumvent her wishes regarding your inheritance. He held up a cream-colored envelope. Given Franklin's explicit statements in the family meeting you described to me, and in the video we just witnessed, I believe we have reached that condition. The room had fallen completely silent, all eyes moving between Theodore, the mysterious envelope, and me. Michael's expression had transformed from confidence to growing alarm. This is highly irregular, one of Dad's business associates objected. Franklin's wishes were clear, as were Eleanor's, Theodore countered calmly, and her legal arrangements predated Franklin's by several years. The courts have already ruled on this matter, though Franklin chose not to disclose those rulings to the family. He looked at me questioningly. Miss Henderson, with your permission, I would like to read your mother's letter now. With a dry mouth and pounding heart, I nodded. Please do. Theodore opened the sealed envelope with careful hands, removing several pages of my mother's distinctive stationery. The sight of her handwriting, even from a distance, sent a wave of emotion through me. My dearest Victoria, Theodore read, his voice gentle with respect for the words. If you are hearing this letter read aloud, it means your father has attempted to deny you your rightful inheritance despite my explicit wishes and legal arrangements. I could almost hear Mom's voice in the words, clear and determined despite the years since her passing. I've always known that Frank sees the world in terms of control and loyalty. I fear that without me there to counter his influence, he would use financial leverage to pressure you into becoming someone you were not meant to be. This trust is my way of ensuring you have the freedom to choose your own path without such pressure. Theodore continued reading as the room remained absolutely silent. Frank and I built our fortune together, and legally half of it has always been mine to direct. I have chosen to protect your future by placing my share of the following assets in an irrevocable trust for your benefit. What followed was a detailed list that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. According to Mom's letter, the trust included half the total value of Henderson Financial Group as assessed at the time of her death, the family vacation home in Maine where we had spent summers, her personal investment portfolio, managed separately from the main family accounts, family heirlooms and artwork that had belonged to her side of the family, a substantial insurance policy she had maintained independently. Frank will likely be angry about these arrangements, the letter continued. He believes that all family resources should serve his vision alone. But you, Victoria, deserve the freedom to create your own vision. Use these resources wisely, with the compassionate heart and clear mind I've always seen in you. The letter concluded with personal words of love and confidence in me that brought tears to my eyes despite my best efforts to maintain composure. As Theodore folded the letter, Michael abruptly stood. This can't be legal, he protested. Dad would have told me if half the company was in some trust. We've been making major business decisions for years based on full ownership. Theodore's expression remained professionally neutral. Franklin was fully informed of these arrangements, Mr. Henderson. If he chose not to share that information with you, that was his decision. I have copies of all the legal notices and court rulings, he added, patting another folder on the table. She manipulated Mom when she was sick, Michael said suddenly, turning to me with accusing eyes. That's the only explanation. Mom would never have undermined Dad's authority like this. The unfairness of the accusation broke through my shock. I knew nothing about this trust until right now, Michael. Nothing. And Mom wasn't manipulated. She was protecting me from exactly the kind of control Dad tried to exert by cutting me off. There's more, Theodore interjected, preventing Michael's retort. Eleanor documented her reasoning extensively, anticipating potential challenges. She included medical certification of her mental competence at the time these decisions were made, well before her diagnosis. He turned to Michael directly. Additionally, sir, your father's attempts to contest these arrangements were not based on claims of Eleanor's incompetence, but rather on technical legal grounds that were ultimately rejected by the courts. The room had grown increasingly tense, with Dad's business associates huddling together in whispered consultation while family members watched the unfolding drama with undisguised interest. "This is going to create chaos at the company," Michael said, his voice rising. "We've made commitments based on asset valuations that didn't account for this theft." "It's not theft when it was legally hers to give," I replied, finding strength in the knowledge that Mom had seen this confrontation coming and prepared for it. "And if there are business complications, perhaps you should ask why Dad hid this information from you for 14 years. Michael's face flushed with anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Dad needed complete control of company assets to secure the Sullivan merger last year. We leveraged everything. If half the company isn't actually ours." He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize he'd said too much. But the implication hung in the air, suddenly illuminating Dad's desperate attempts to maintain the illusion of complete ownership and his fury at my potential claim. "The Sullivan merger?" Aunt Margaret spoke for the first time. "Frank told the family that merger fell through." One of Dad's business partners cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should discuss these matters privately, Michael." But Michael was too agitated to heed the warning. "Victoria has no right to any of this. She hasn't worked a day in her life for Henderson Financial. She actively opposes everything we stand for. Dad promised me I would inherit everything." "Promised you when?" I asked, a suspicion forming. "Before or after Mom died?" Michael's hesitation was answer enough. "He knew about Mom's trust the whole time, didn't he?" I pressed. "He knew, but he let you believe you'd get everything anyway. He probably told you he'd find a way around it." Theodore intervened with professional calm. "If I may clarify the legal reality, Eleanor Henderson's trust is irrevocable and has withstood multiple challenges. The courts have consistently upheld its validity. Franklin was legally obligated to disclose its existence in any business dealings involving the affected assets." "Dad wouldn't have hidden something that important," Michael insisted, but doubt had crept into his voice. Aunt Margaret sighed heavily. "Oh, Michael, your father was brilliant but not always forthright, especially when it came to getting his way. If he let you believe you'd inherit everything despite knowing otherwise. I'm sorry, but that sounds exactly like Frank." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as Michael struggled visibly with this revelation. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness watching my brother's idealized image of our father crumble in real time. "There's something else you should know," Theodore said, his tone gentler now. "Franklin's recent investments have not performed as represented in company statements. The Sullivan merger you mentioned was essentially a bailout disguised as an acquisition, necessitated by significant losses in Asian markets." This announcement sent another shockwave through the room. Dad's closest business associates exchanged alarmed glances while family members looked confused. "How do you know this?" Michael demanded. "Eleanor maintained connections with financial analysts who continued to monitor Henderson Financial at my request," Theodore explained. "She was concerned about Frank's increasingly aggressive investment strategies even before her illness." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Dad's desperation to control all family assets, his fury at my potential claim on half the company, his public humiliation of me to justify cutting me out completely. It wasn't just about control or disappointment in my career choices. It was about needing my inheritance to cover business losses. "He was going to use my inheritance to bail out the company," I said aloud, the realization dawning fully. "That's why he was so adamant about me getting nothing." Aunt Margaret nodded slowly. "Frank always did believe the ends justified the means, especially when it came to Henderson Financial." Michael sank back into his chair, looking shell-shocked. "I need to see the company financials. The real ones, not what Dad showed me." "Of course," Theodore agreed. "My firm can arrange an independent audit if you wish. But first, We should complete today's official business. He turned to me with quiet respect. Ms. Henderson, as the beneficiary of Eleanor's trust, you now control assets of significant value. I would be honored to continue serving as trustee if you wish, or to transfer control directly to you or representatives of your choosing. The full impact of what had just happened began to settle on me. After years of believing I had been cut off completely, I now found myself inheriting half of everything, not through Dad's approval, which I'd never earned, but through Mom's foresight and love. I looked around the room at the stunned faces of family members and business associates, at Michael's confusion and anger, at the documents that represented Mom's final act of protection. I think, I said carefully, that I'll need some time to consider all the options. But I want to be clear about one thing. I met Michael's gaze directly. I have no interest in destroying what Dad built, despite how he treated me. Whatever decisions I make about these assets will be thoughtful and fair. Fair, Michael repeated incredulously. You know nothing about the business. You've spent your career fighting against companies like ours. How could your involvement possibly be fair to Dad's legacy? Something in me shifted then, a final release of the need for approval that had shaped so much of my life. I stood, gathering the strength Mom had always seen in me. Dad's legacy isn't just Henderson Financial, Michael. It's also us, what he taught us, how he treated us, the people we became because of, and sometimes despite him. I may not have his approval, but I have something he never gave me credit for, my own moral compass and the courage to follow it. That's what Mom protected, and I won't dishonor her by shrinking now. The room fell silent as my words landed. For perhaps the first time in my life, I felt truly seen by these people who had witnessed my humiliation just weeks before. Theodore smiled slightly, a glint of approval in his eyes. Well said, Ms. Henderson. Now, shall we discuss next steps? In the conference room, after most attendees had departed, Theodore outlined the immediate practical matters requiring attention. Michael remained, still processing the revelations but pragmatic enough to recognize we needed to work together, at least temporarily. The trust structure gives you considerable flexibility, Theodore explained, spreading documents across the table. You can maintain ownership through the trust or transfer assets directly to your name. For the company's shares specifically, you could remain a silent partner, take an active role, or even sell your portion if you wished. The options were overwhelming after years of believing I had no stake in the family fortune. I need time to think, I admitted, and probably better financial advisors than I currently have. Theodore smiled kindly. Your mother anticipated you might feel unprepared. She left detailed recommendations for financial advisors who share your ethical priorities. And I remain at your service, having promised Eleanor I would look after your interests. You were her friend, weren't you? I asked. Not just her lawyer. I had that honor, yes, Theodore confirmed. Eleanor was a remarkable woman with tremendous foresight. She understood your father better than he realized and moved to protect you accordingly. We agreed on temporary arrangements. Theodore would continue managing the trust while I educated myself about the assets and options. Michael would maintain day-to-day operations at Henderson Financial, with the understanding that major decisions now required my consultation. As the meeting concluded, Theodore handed me a small wooden box. Eleanor left this for you as well. She asked that I give it to you privately after the trust was revealed. Alone in my apartment that evening, I opened the box to find a handwritten note atop a vintage sapphire ring I remembered Mom wearing on special occasions. Victoria, the note read, this ring belonged to my grandmother, who left an abusive marriage in 1923 with nothing but this ring and her determination to build a better life. She sold it to start a small business, then worked until she could buy it back years later. It symbolizes the courage to value yourself when others don't. Now it's yours, along with the resources to build whatever life you choose. All my love, always. The tears came then, not of sadness, but of profound connection to the mother who had seen and protected me even beyond her death. The following week, Aunt Margaret invited me to coffee at her favorite patisserie. Unlike other family members who seemed uncertain how to treat me after the will reading, Margaret had always shown me genuine affection. I wanted to talk to you about your father, she said once we were settled with our drinks. Not to excuse what he did, but perhaps to help you understand it. She told me stories I'd never heard about Dad's own childhood, about his father's emotional abuse and financial control, about the impossible standards he'd faced, and the fear of failure that drove him. Frank became what he knew, Margaret explained gently. He recreated with you and Michael the dynamic he experienced with his own father. Recognizing a pattern doesn't excuse it, but sometimes understanding helps with healing. Did Mom know all this? I asked. Oh, yes. She tried for years to help Frank see what he was doing, but some wounds go too deep for easy healing. When she realized she couldn't change him, she focused instead on protecting you. The conversation gave me a context for Dad's behavior I'd never fully considered. It didn't erase the hurt, but somehow made it less personal, less about my inherent value, and more about his unresolved pain. In the weeks that followed, I faced significant decisions about my inheritance. With Theodore's guidance and input from financial advisors specializing in socially responsible investing, I developed a plan that honored both Mom's intentions and my own values. I kept the main vacation home, the place where Mom and I had shared our happiest times. The first weekend I returned there, walking the familiar paths along the rocky coastline, I felt her presence in every corner of the property. In the master bedroom closet, I discovered a box of letters she'd written to me, dated for future birthdays and life milestones, another act of love extending beyond her death. For the Henderson financial shares, I chose a middle path. Rather than selling immediately or trying to take an active role in a business I didn't understand, I established clear ethical guidelines for my portion of the company. Michael initially bristled at these constraints, but gradually came to see the business advantages of stronger environmental and social responsibility policies, especially as younger investors demanded such commitments. With another portion of the inheritance, I established the Eleanor Henderson Scholarship Fund for environmental law students from disadvantaged backgrounds, creating a legacy that aligned with both Mom's generosity and my professional passion. When Rachel mentioned her dream of starting an environmental consulting firm but lacking startup capital, I invested in her vision, becoming a silent partner in what would eventually grow into a successful business advising companies on sustainable practices. The healing process wasn't linear or simple. There were days when Dad's cruel words still echoed in my mind, when the public humiliation still stung despite the eventual vindication. But slowly, I reclaimed the family narrative, finding ways to honor Mom's memory while creating healthy distance from Dad's toxic influence. Daniel and I spent weekends at the vacation home, creating new memories in spaces previously shadowed by complicated family dynamics. We planted a garden Mom would have loved, renovated the kitchen to better suit our cooking adventures, and hosted gatherings of friends who filled the rooms with laughter and genuine affection. The most difficult decision involved my relationship with Michael. After the initial shock and anger faded, he reached out tentatively, suggesting lunch to discuss practical matters. Our first meeting was stiff and businesslike, but as monthly discussions became routine, something shifted gradually between us. "I've been thinking about how Dad treated you," he said during one such lunch, nearly 6 months after the will reading. I didn't see it clearly then. Or maybe I didn't want to see it. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a small opening towards something different. We would never be close in the way some siblings were. Too much history stood between us for that, but we found a cautious respect that might, in time, grow into something more. With the extended family, I established clear boundaries. Those who had witnessed my humiliation without speaking up needed to acknowledge that hurt before re-entering my life. Some rose to that challenge, others didn't. I learned to be comfortable with smaller family gatherings of those who truly valued me. As Theodore had predicted, Michael eventually abandoned thoughts of contesting Mom's trust. The legal standing was unassailable, and more importantly, the discovery of Dad's financial misrepresentations had shaken Michael's certainty about everything he believed about our father. An independent audit revealed the full extent of Dad's risky investments and mounting losses in the years before his death. The company was far less stable than publicly represented, lending even more insight into his desperate attempts to maintain control of all family assets. He was gambling with the company's future, Michael admitted during one of our business discussions. If he'd been honest with me, with the board, we could have corrected course earlier. It was perhaps the most valuable inheritance Dad inadvertently left us, a stark lesson in the cost of pride, secrecy, and emotional control. A lesson in what not to carry forward. 1 year after the dramatic will reading, my life had transformed in ways I could never have imagined. The external changes were obvious: financial security, ownership of family properties, professional opportunities expanded through connections and resources previously unavailable to me. But the internal shifts were far more significant. Standing in the living room of my new home, a modest but beautiful house near the park where Daniel and I liked to run, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I saw a woman who no longer flinched at criticism, who didn't automatically assume she was wrong or inadequate when faced with opposition. The constant background anxiety of seeking approval had finally, truly quieted. My environmental law practice had evolved to include more systemic change work, using resources from the trust to support cases that might otherwise go unfunded. I found deep satisfaction in using inheritance money to challenge the very industries Dad had considered untouchable, not out of spite but from genuine conviction about corporate responsibility. Daniel and I had gotten engaged during a sunset walk on the beach behind the main house, the sapphire ring that had belonged to Mom's grandmother now paired with a simple engagement band. We planned a small wedding for the following spring, surrounded by people who truly celebrated our happiness. The legal matters with Michael had largely resolved, with clear agreements about company management and regular consultations on major decisions. Our personal relationship remained a work in progress, but the brittle hostility had given way to something resembling mutual respect, if not yet warmth. In quiet moments, I still reflected on my complicated relationship with Dad. Understanding the generational trauma that shaped him didn't excuse his cruelty, but helped me contextualize it. He had recreated with his children the only family dynamic he knew, perpetuating patterns of emotional withholding and conditional approval that had damaged him in his own childhood. I made a conscious decision to break that cycle. With Daniel, with future children we might have, with colleagues and friends, I practiced the open appreciation and unconditional support that Dad had never been able to offer. I gave myself permission to acknowledge my accomplishments without the self-criticism Dad had instilled. Through continued therapy and journaling, I worked to separate Dad's voice from my internal dialogue. When I caught myself thinking, not good enough, or must try harder in his critical tone, I consciously replaced those thoughts with Mom's affirming perspective. Over time, my internal compass recalibrated to something healthier and more balanced. Mom's influence remained a constant source of strength. Through her journals, letters, and the legal protections she established, she had created a safety net that caught me when I needed it most. Her foresight in recognizing Dad's potential for financial manipulation had protected not just my inheritance, but my autonomy. The lessons from this difficult journey crystallized over time. True worth is never determined by another person's assessment, even a parent's. Dad's useless child verdict reflected his limitations, not mine. Family relationships require boundaries to be healthy. Blood connections alone don't entitle anyone to cause harm without consequences. Chosen family can provide the support and unconditional acceptance that biological family sometimes fails to offer. Rachel, Daniel, and other close friends had stood by me through everything with love that asked nothing in return. Breaking generational patterns requires conscious effort and courage. The easy path would have been to internalize Dad's critical voice and pass that same damage forward. Vulnerability and authenticity, qualities Dad considered weaknesses, were actually sources of profound strength. My ability to acknowledge hurt, seek help, and remain open to connection had ultimately created a richer life than Dad's isolated pursuit of control ever could. As Daniel and I planned our future together, I felt genuinely optimistic. The shadow of never being good enough had finally lifted. I was building a life aligned with my own values rather than desperately seeking approval that would never come. I still visited Mom's grave regularly, bringing her favorite tulips and updating her on my life, as if we were having one of our Sunday conversations. You saw me clearly when no one else did, I told her on my last visit. You protected me when I couldn't protect myself. Everything I am building now grows from the foundation of your love. For anyone struggling with family rejection or conditional love, I hope my story offers some comfort. You don't need another person's approval to be worthy, even when that person is a parent. Your value exists independently of others' ability to recognize it. Sometimes the healthiest family is the one you create for yourself, built on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation or control. Finding freedom from the need for impossible approval wasn't easy or quick, but it was worth every difficult step. Mom knew that freedom was what I needed most. Not money or property, but the liberation to become fully myself without the crushing weight of Dad's disappointment. "You're a useless child," he had said, delivering what he thought was the ultimate rejection. He couldn't have known those cruel words would ultimately set me free from the lifelong pursuit of his approval, opening the door to an authenticity and peace he never managed to find himself. Have you ever experienced family rejection or had to create boundaries with toxic relatives? How did you find healing? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about overcoming family challenges and finding your own worth. Thank you for listening, and remember, your value is inherent, not something anyone else can give or take away.